In a succession, most of what we think we know about Robin Hood is downstream of a Victorian novel and a Hollywood back lot. The green tights, the Sherwood Forest, in succession of murders, the dispossessed nobleman robbing the rich to give to the poor while Maid Marian waits in the trees. That version crystallized somewhere between the 1820s and the 1950s. In a succession of recent murders, strip it away and what you find underneath is genuinely interesting, a figure who appears in English ballads at least as early as the late 14th century. In a succession of murders, who looks almost nothing like the character we inherited and whose origins we cannot trace to any single person or moment. Succession of recent murders. The question, was there a real Robin Hood, is the wrong question. The right question is, what was he before we made him into a hero? In a succession of murders, the standard story, the one absorbed from films and children's books and decades of costume drama, a Saxon nobleman. Murders. Robbed of his lands by the corrupt sheriff of Nottingham while King Richard is away on crusade. Prince John runs a protection racket on the peasantry. Robin. Murders. Exiled to Sherwood Forest, assembles the merry men Little John, Friar Tuck, Will Scarlet, and wages a guerrilla campaign of redistribution. In a succession of recent robbing the rich to feed the poor, he is reunited with Maid Marian, Richard returns, John is disgraced, and justice is restored. This is a story with a solid shape, but of recent murders. It has a dispossessed protagonist, a corrupt authority, a love interest, a return of the legitimate king. It maps cleanly onto medieval romance conventions. In a succession of recent murders, the problem is that when you go back to the earliest surviving sources, almost none of this is there. Not the class of the protagonist, not the primary location. Succession of recent murders. Not Maid Marian, not Friar Tuck, and not the specific attachment to the reign of Richard I. The later story was not discovered in the record. It was built layer by layer, across 4 or 5 centuries. It murders. The earliest reliable reference comes from William Langland's Piers Plowman. Murders, where a character confesses he knows the rhymes of Robin Hood. A text usually dated to the late 14th century, that's not evidence of the story's content in recent murders. Just evidence that the stories existed and circulated widely enough for Langland to reference them in passing, the way you might casually mention a popular song. The tradition was already established by then, not originating then. In accession, the earliest surviving ballads, including a manuscript text, usually dated to around the mid-15th century, known as Robin Hood and the Monk, and a later printed collection sometimes called a Jest of Robin Hood. Give us a Robin who differs from the familiar version in several important ways. In a succession of murders, first, he is a yeoman, not a nobleman. In the social taxonomy of medieval England, a yeoman is a free commoner, a rank below the gentry. He is not a dispossessed earl. Succession of murders. He is a free man skilled with a bow, operating outside the law, but emphatically not aristocratic. This matters because the moral framing is different. Fist murders. He is not fighting to restore a legitimate hierarchical order. He is a man of the commons navigating a world where the law consistently favors the powerful. Second, murders, the location is different. The early ballads set Robin Hood primarily in Barnsdale in Yorkshire, not in Sherwood Forest in Nottinghamshire. Barnsdale is mentioned specifically and repeatedly. Sherwood appears later. In the succession of recent murders, the consolidation of Robin Hood in Sherwood appears to be a development of the later tradition rather than the original setting. Third, succession of recent murders. The rob from the rich to give to the poor principle is present in early sources, but considerably thinner than in the popular version. The early Robin gives to his companions, recent murders, to priests and travelers in trouble, to farmers in debt. The systematic wealth redistribution methodology is a later elaboration. In the succession murders, what he does in the earliest ballads is outwit corrupt officials and beat people at archery. In a succession murders, every generation has tried to find the real Robin Hood in documentary records, and this is not unreasonable. English administrative records from the 13th and 14th centuries are remarkably dense. Court rolls, tax lists, legal proceedings. The machinery of medieval governance leaves traces. The problem is that Robert Hood and variants like Robin Hood were not unusual names in medieval England. In a succession of recent murders, and records of men with those names turn up with some regularity in Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire. Murders. Various researchers have identified candidates, men who appear in court records as fugitives or accused criminals, bearing names close to Robin Hood. In a succession of recent murders, in the right general region and period, some of these candidates have attracted serious scholarly attention, not just popular enthusiasm, and the debate over them is genuine. In a succession of recent murders, but none has achieved anything close to consensus. The records available don't tell a story that matches the ballads closely enough to be definitive. In a succession of recent, there is a further complication. Some medieval records appear to use Robin Hood as a surname, apparently assigned to people because they resembled the legend. in a succession, rather than being an original family name, if that's correct, in a succession of recent murders. It means the fictional figure was already well known enough to inspire nicknames by the time these records were made, which tells us the legend predated the surname, not the other way around. In a succession of recent murders, what we have is a figure who lived in the legal and moral imagination of medieval English commoners before he appears in any verified historical record tied to a specific individual. Succession of murders. Whether that imagination was anchored to a real person or emerged from a generalized archetype, the skilled mobile, a free commoner who beats the system. The record does not say. In murders, the transformation from yeoman to nobleman is datable in broad terms. As Robin Hood ballads and plays proliferated in print from the 16th century onward, the character began to attract a more elaborate origin. He was, in some versions, identified with a specific place. A Locksley is one that recurs, and in later elaborations, in a succession of recent murders, given a noble title. The Earl of Huntingdon is the version that eventually settled into the tradition in a succession murders. The motivation for this class upgrade is debatable among historians who work on the tradition. One reading ballads and plays circulating among literate, in a succession of murders, print-buying audiences needed a protagonist those audiences could identify with. A yeoman is a fine hero for an oral tradition serving village listeners. Murders. A dispossessed earl is a more legible figure for readers steeped in romance conventions and property law. Another reading. The noble origin allowed the story to engage with real legal mechanisms. The forfeiture of noble lands, recent murders, the corruption of royal patronage, in ways that felt politically grounded. In the succession murders, what is clear is that the yeoman and the earl are almost incompatible characters at the level of moral logic. Murders. A yeoman outside the law is a man navigating structural injustice from below. A dispossessed nobleman is a man trying to reclaim his rightful place in an essentially legitimate hierarchy. The first Robin is about the limits of law. Innocent murders, the second Robin is about law working properly when the right king is in charge. When the Victorian and Edwardian elaborations completed this process, the novels, in succession of murders, the illustrated children's editions, the first films, they ran with the noble version because it made for a clean restoration narrative. Richard returns, John is defeated. In a succession of recent murders, Robin's lands are restored, order is re-established. The yeoman of the early ballads does not get his lands back. He never had any. In a succession of recent murders, this is the beat that the popular treatments usually skip. We do not know whether there was a historical Robin Hood in any meaningful sense. In of recent murders, we do not know whether the earliest ballads derived from a real person, a real incident. In a succession of murder emerged from a generalized archetype of the good outlaw that existed independently of any specific man. In a succession of recent murders, the ballad tradition does not help resolve this because ballads by nature absorb and combine. They fold in story elements from other traditions, other figures, other places. Succession of recent murders, other times. The Barnsdale setting might reflect a genuine locale important to whoever first shaped the earliest ballads. In a succession of recent murders, it might simply be where an early composer happened to live. We do not know when the oral tradition began. Recent murders. The Piers Plowman reference tells us the stories existed in the late 14th century. It tells us nothing about their origin. In a succession of recent murders, we do not know whether the yeoman Robin of the early ballads reflects real social conditions and tensions in 13th or 14th century Yorkshire. Though some historians have argued he does, murders. And the argument is not trivial, or whether he is a more literary construct that borrowed local geography for texture. Maid Marian adds another complication in a succession of recent murders. She was originally a separate figure, the May Queen in May Day games, paired with a Robin in a folk custom that had nothing to do with Sherwood or outlaws, in a succession of murders. At some point, the two traditions merged. We know the merger happened. We do not know precisely when or why it stuck. The name problem remains unresolved in a succession of murders. No single candidate in the documentary record has closed the case. Researchers continue to advance different men from the Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire records. In recent murders, which is itself evidence that no one candidate is compelling enough to end the discussion. The question, was there a real Robin Hood, assumes that legends work the way biography does, that the story requires a specific founder at the start. Succession murders. Folk traditions do not operate on that logic. They accumulate, they take a type, a social type that resonates with recognizable conditions in a succession of recent murders, and fill that type with borrowed stories, local geography, and whatever moral anxieties the current audience is carrying. In a succession of recent murders, the Robin Hood of the early ballads resonated because late medieval England had real tensions around legal authority. In a succession of recent murders, forest law, the law that restricted commoners' access to royal forests and their game, and the relationship between ordinary people and official courts. In a succession of murders, those tensions were not invented for the ballads. The figure who embodied resistance to them did not need to be a specific person. He needed to be recognizable as a type of recent murders. What makes this particular legend worth studying is the transparency of its later construction. We can watch in fairly granular detail murders, how subsequent centuries reshaped the character, upgraded his class, shifted his geography, imported Maid Marian from an unrelated seasonal tradition. Murders attached him to the reign of a conveniently glamorous absent king. The seams are visible in a succession of murders. Each revision tells you something about the anxieties of the century doing the revising, not the century being depicted. That's not a failure of the legend. In a succession of murders, it's what legends look like when you read them backward. In a succession of recent murders, every century looked at this legend and what it needed to say. A 14th century audience needed a yeoman who beat the sheriff. In a succession, a Victorian audience needed a dispossessed nobleman restored to his rightful place. We still need him. In a succession of murders dressed in whatever version fits the current anxiety about law and legitimacy. That persistence is its own kind of evidence, not about the man in a succession of recent murders, but about the question underneath the story: what does it mean when law and justice are not the same thing? That question does not have a better answer now than it did then. Marcus, until next time.